Good morning. I bet you thought you were done with me for the day, weren't you? I'm going to be your facilitator for this session. So your first presenter today will be Angela Kraus. And Angela is a native West Virginian, but she will give a presentation for you today. And we'll hold questions and answers till after.
Wow, I'm so excited to be here. I feel so privileged to be at this conference. And I'm excited to tell my story, so let's just jump right into it. When I was majoring in history at Glenville State College back in the day, I received notification from the placement office of a job as curator of the Pearl Buck Museum in Hillsborough, West Virginia. The pay seemed challenging. To live in Hillsborough at the time seemed even more challenging. And so that dream died quick. I let it go. Many moons, 2 marriages, 2 degrees, too many jobs, 4 babies later, I was on one of my roaming adventures in my beloved state of West Virginia. I was looking for the architectural twin of yet another love of mine, the Landmark Studio for the Arts in Sutton, West Virginia, where I was living at the time. The Landmark is a magnificent old Methodist church with exquisite stained glass windows, hippie transformed into an intriguing, successful community theater. I think Pearl Buck would be pleased. In my usual fashion, I headed out with the best of intentions, but ended up lost more than once, which is always a good thing. I had gotten Hinton and Huttonsville mixed up in my full-mindedness and dyslexic alliteration, and I found myself driving the longer distance of West Virginia's Route 219 from Elkins to Lewisburg. What a glorious day for a road trip. I was feeling particularly independent. Pearl would be impressed. As I drove down the highway, enjoying the beauty of my home state and the Seneca Trail, so those of you who are going on the bus, you're in for a treat, I came up on the sign for the Pearl Buck House. And I took a sudden turn off the highway for an impromptu visit. It had been a long time since I had thought about her. I knew Pearl was famous for the good earth. I can't recall how or when I learned that, but I know it wasn't in Catholic school or from my family. Perhaps it was in one of my English classes at Glenville State, but we didn't study her in any depth, nor do I recall reading The Good Earth. Even though I knew the title and that it was hers, and that she was born in West Virginia, and that she received an award for this work. On this day, as I explored her West Virginia home, I was astounded at how many books she had written. I got goosebumps wondering what my life might have been if I had taken more interest in that offer to work there all those moons ago. As I wove my way back home, I came upon a bookstore in the Bend. How could I resist that, book lover that I am? So with Pearl in mind, I struck up a conversation with the retired teacher, owner, operator of Buckeye Bend Books and asked if he had any of Pearl's works. And he did. I bought 2, if I recall, not sure which ones they were. In conversation, he said to me, "You know, the reason she got published was because she married a publisher." My feminist sensibilities were immediately awakened, but I smiled them away and filed his seemingly chauvinistic comment for later reflection, and we parted on good terms. After I had satisfied my curiosity about the Landmark's architectural twin, I returned, with my Pearl Buck books in hand, I returned to my small town of Sutton. My curiosity about Pearl kept bouncing about in my busy brain. So I went to the local public library to see what else I could find. The librarian, whom I'd struck up a friendly relationship with, said to me, "You know, I have a whole box of her books back there in storage that I never have taken the time to shelve." Now that got my goat too, so I encouraged her to do just that ASAP, which she agreed to. Then she commented to me, "She was a troubled woman, wasn't she?" Here we go again. Just as I'd never thought of Pearl as a woman who married a publisher to get published, neither had I had any inclination to think of her as, quote, troubled. I fake smiled my way through my feminist sensibilities again and resolved to look into that judgment of Pearl ASAP. Home and in the comforts of my second-story apartment, I immediately set about voraciously reading the books I bought at Buckeye Bin Books, and the one I had checked out at the library, The Good Earth. I Googled keywords, Pearl Buck Troubled Woman. And lo and behold, a fairly new biography of her came up. The complete preface to Pearl S. Buck, a cultural biography by Peter Kahn, was right there to read on the University of Pennsylvania Department of English website. After reading that, I immediately ordered Professor Kahn's book from Amazon for a pittance. I wrote the author to thank him, apologized for the small price I paid for his work, and I received a gratifying note in return. It was this paragraph in the preface that linked me up to his amazing book. He wrote, and I quote, "I have not written a saint's life. Pearl Buck, as I've gotten to know her, was a troubled, conflicted, often limited woman capable of cruelty as well as kindness. At the same time, this book is not a pathography, to use Joyce Carol Oates' term for the current fashion of biographical debunking. Professor Kahn goes on to say, whatever my reservations about her commitments or her accomplishments, I've grown to admire Pearl Buck, and I've learned a great deal from her. Her engagement in the major issues of her time is a rare and instructive example of a writer accepting her responsibilities to the larger society and dedicating her energy and influence to serve a vision of the common good." Excuse me. As I gobbled down each Pearl book, I trekked off to the library for the next, prompting the librarian to stick to her word to get them on the shelf. I just couldn't get enough of Pearl. I started sharing my Pearl Buck journey on Facebook with photos of her and snippets about my reading adventure, and enjoyed a few likes and comments. Soon, I learned that some of her books had been made into movies. Who knew? That she wrote plays. Oh my. I'm still looking for her play, The White Bird. Can anybody out there help me? Actually, I did find it online for $3,000. I signed up to stream movies just for the sake of getting a Pearl movie, only to find that they were only available on movies by mail. So I had to delay my Pearl passion for a bit, but very soon I was drinking in The Good Earth on my TV. Then, as serendipitous life would have it, my daughter, having moved to Boston, wanted me to come to be her granny nanny, and we planned a spring break trial run. With Pearl now inhabiting my heart, I checked to see whether I could combine my trip to Boston with a stop-off at Percy, am I saying it right, Pennsylvania, where I had learned Pearl lived much of her adult life. By then, I had read The Child Who Never Grew, the main reason for her writing The Good Earth, to pay for her intellectually challenged daughter's health care. I also learned that she had been friends with James Michener and Oscar Hammerstein. So fascinating, since Michener had been my favorite author from my younger days, and I had several of his books and his autobiography on my bookshelf. I had no idea he and Pearl were friends. So I Googled the closest place to stay and planned my West Virginia to Boston layover to be with Pearl in Percy. And while I was at it, a trip to the James Michener Museum in the same neck of the woods. I was so excited. All those dreams came true. Best laid plans that came to pass. I drove from Allentown, PA, through Quakertown, and wound my way to the farm at Percy. It was a bit ruffled up with recent bad weather, but open nonetheless. I went on the tour. I stood in Pearl's writing room. I enjoyed her artful home place with goosebumps all over. I even found James Michener not much farther away down the highway, and I had a seance with him too. Life was so delicious. By then, I had read some of the controversy about Ted, the dance instructor that waltzed into Pearl's life in her last decade. 40 years younger, he was her partner in passion in her final years. Of course, I had to know more, so at the Pearl Buck International Gift Shop, I asked for Ted's books. I wanted to read For Spacious Skies. The clerk seemed to become a bit embarrassed and muttered something about being a taboo subject at this foundation. In time, I would come to understand why. Inquiring minds want to know. When I got home, I printed out a list of Pearl's writings and checked them off as I finished them, hungry for the next. I read Portrait of a Marriage, about a female artist's life. I read God's Men, about two male missionaries and their quite different approaches to missionary work. I read Kinfolk, about the children of Chinese Americans who returned to China to live, much to the chagrin of their parents. I read The Time is Noon, about a woman as a daughter, sister, wife, and mother in quest of herself as she grows into womanhood. The Lover and Other Stories, Imperial Woman, Pavilion of Women, East Wind, West Wind. There was no end to the treasure of good reads by Pearl. As if all these delicious novels weren't enough, I read her memoirs, The Exile, about her mother, The Fighting Angel, the book about her father. And then there were children's books to track down. The Big Wave, a story about how life always wins out over death. Christmas Day in the Morning, a delightful holiday tale about a gift of love from a boy to his father. The Little Fox in the Middle, who knew? I was in Pearl Buck heaven. But then, learning about her final years in Vermont was hard to swallow. At first I thought, oh no, she lost it in the end. No wonder the foundation wanted nothing to do with this part of her story. But did she really? The more I read between the lines and researched, the more it seems like Pearl was just being Pearl, taking charge of her life, creating a space she could grow in, helping others around her do the same. It's all in how you interpret her actions, I guess. I cling to these words from her sister Grace in Nora Sterling's biography of Pearl. Grace said about Ted, and I quote, "I know nothing about him personally or his integrity, but I know that nobody could have done as much for my sister in her dying months. He filled a very great need for her in terms of loneliness and of interest and of family. These were the things she got from him that were very important, and he didn't run out. He stayed." And she added, "Anything else aside, I do feel he was deeply and emotionally fond of my sister. Loved her absolutely. I won't try to describe what kind of love, but in the last months, I often saw him sit down and weep." Then came the news of another book. It was like an episode out of Storage Wars. A final manuscript of Pearl's turned up in a storage locker in Texas, sold off for want of the rent payment. This manuscript, The Eternal Wonder, was written in those years while Pearl was passing on in her 80s. There's a great interview online on Blog Talk Radio Conversation Live with Pearl's son Edgar, where he tells Cyrus Webb of the tale of this discovery. Of course, I had to order that book ASAP. In this interview, Edgar Walsh makes the point that his mother was a non-stop writer. As he reports, she wrote 43 novels, 28 nonfiction books, 242 short stories, 500 articles, 37 children's books, 18 film and TV scripts, several stage and musical plays, and thousands of letters. I mean, that's just amazing given all the other things she was also doing. At the West Virginia Hillsborough House, sorry, I have a little bit of cold this morning, the curator had told me that much of Pearl's work had been moved to West Virginia Wesleyan College for safekeeping. I made up my mind to make a visit there and was pleased to meet a young archivist, guess who, Brett Miller, who couldn't have been nicer. He unlocked Pearl's special collection and ushered me into a comfortable seat and allowed me a silent presence with papers full of stories. One that I remember was a short story about a middle-aged woman and man who had been dating for some time, but had postponed marriage due to the fact that they both were caring for aging parents, and neither had much money to brag about. At the point in the story when they are both secretly harboring thoughts of proposing marriage, even as they know it isn't wise, the woman finds herself pregnant. After much soul-searching, the woman comes to the understanding that it would not make sense for them to bring a baby into the world in their circumstances, and she opts for an abortion. A timely piece for sure. Another work that stayed with me was her essay for the International Women League for Peace and Freedom. I actually recently ran into this group carrying their banner at a Veterans for Peace rally in Boston. That was a joy to see after all these years. Here are Pearl's words from way back when. Introduction to International Women's League for Peace and Freedom by Pearl Buck. Our country needs women. It needs the thinking of women, the planning of women, the influence of women. Men and women are different but equally important. There can be no balance and wisdom in national and international affairs unless and until women take part in life. We women must do our work everywhere. Can we do it, busy as we are with homes and children, with jobs and personal responsibilities? Yes, we can. I have to tell you that it was very hard for me to get a week off from my granny nanny to be at this conference. But as Pearl goes on to say, we can do it by working together with other women like ourselves. What one woman cannot accomplish, many women working together can. At heart, we women all want the same kind of world, a place where human beings can live and work in peace and freedom. Brett gave me references for yet another Pearl place, Randolph College. I have yet to pursue that, something to look forward to, yet more proof of her proliferation. I left the West Virginia Wesleyan campus anxious to return. I thought I'd found this kind of secret treasure all mine. So of course, I was much surprised to learn down the road that Pearl had moved on me yet again. She was now housed at West Virginia University. So I've come full circle and finally caught up with Pearl in one of her many resting places. What an amazing person, Pearl S. Buck. So ahead of her time. Her life, a better novel than any I've read. Truth is stranger than fiction. Was she published because she married a publisher? Hardly. Her publisher continued to publish because he was lucky enough to secure rights to the good earth and lucky enough to marry her so that he had a constant flow of publishable works to keep his company afloat. When times got tight, he turned to Pearl to finish another book. I think my book bargain friend Gerald got that backwards. Was she a troubled woman? Hardly. The world around her was troubled, and she saw right through it and took on the task of making it right. She was a troubleshooter. Did that make trouble for her? For sure. And she remained strong in the face of it all. She upset the status quo. She questioned the values of the dominant male society everywhere she existed, West Virginia, China, Pennsylvania, Vermont. She created a new society for herself and lived an example of courage and truth to power. An amazing role model for all of us to the bittersweet end. Was she a saint? Remember how Peter Kahn said about his book, "I'm not writing about a saint here." As someone who grew up with saints as my role models, I would have to counter, what is a saint? Given the ones that I studied, none of them could hold a candle to Pearl and the huge impact she had on making this world a better place for everybody. I would canonize her any day of the week. I think if I had to come up with one word to describe Pearl, it would be caretaker. In fact, I think from here on out, for my part, I will call her Pearl Comfort. Buck was, after all, her first husband's name. I gather she kept it because it was her daughter Carol's name too, as well as her adopted daughter Janice. Stolting and Steidenstricker were her grandfather and father's names, both a mouthful. By the time she married John Walsh, her public persona of Pearl S. Buck was already established, I guess. So I gather that's why she didn't take on his name, even though they adopted a slew of children together. Her given birth name was Pearl Comfort. Pearl brought so much comfort to so many people. She cared for each of her parents in turn, her mentally challenged daughter Carol, her siblings, her second husband John Walsh, the publisher, who suffered long illness, 7 adopted children, Janice, Richard, John, Edgar, Jean, Henriette, Chico, am I saying that name right? Friends, and employees. She was forever caretaking, all the while casting her social justice concerns out to the world at large, be it children's rights, women's rights, civil rights, immigration rights. Peter Kahn said it best in that first paragraph I read, and I repeat. Pearl's engagement in the major issues of her time as a rare and instructive example of a writer accepting her responsibilities to the larger society and dedicating her energy and influence to serve a vision of the common good. This is a never-ending story. There's a stage play, Welcome Home, by West Virginia playwright Courtney Smith, about Pearl, James, and Oscar that I have yet to see. There's novels inspired by Pearl's life. Read An Chi Min's Pearl of China. An Chi was instructed as a teen in Shanghai Middle School to denounce Pearl Buck and was not allowed to read The Good Earth. It was 25 years later, while on a book tour with her own novel, Red Azalea, that she was handed a paperback copy of The Good Earth by one of her fans. An Chi says she read the book on her flight from Chicago to Los Angeles and broke down and sobbed because she had never seen anyone who wrote Chinese peasants the way Pearl did, with such love, affection, and humanity. And it was at that very moment An Chi's novel, Pearl of China, was conceived. I recommend it. Then there's the dance theater production. I missed a missed opportunity my sister in Manhattan invited me to see at the Lincoln Center. The initiative of Angela Tang, a Chinese producer whose company Legend River Entertainment operates between Beijing and Los Angeles. The choreographer and director Daniel Ezralo said, it was clear that Angela and her investors wanted the show to bridge cultures. I can't wait for the screenplay about Pearl Comfort. Thank you for listening to my never-ending story. And I feel so much gratitude to have been a part of this conference. And I really want to thank West Virginia University for lifting Pearl up where she belongs. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. That was very nice. Very nice. So for our second presentation, we will have Cindy Loudon from the Pearl S. Buck Writing Center with Will the Real Pearl Buck Please Stand Up? The Many Names of Pearl Buck. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent paper. Really appreciate it. And since we've had the Writing Center, the topics are no longer taboo.
Oh, good. Good. That's good to know.
It's a real privilege also to be here. And I learned a new word, Appalachian country. Appalachian, jeez. Yeah, I've had 70 plus years of saying the Appalachians, so Appalachians. All right, now I'm getting the real one, okay. The many names and titles of Pearl Buck. In nature, a pearl is formed when a foreign object slips into an oyster's shell and acts as an irritant which forces the oyster to build up layers of protective tissue or nacre to surround that foreign object. Layer by layer, the coats of nacre are separated by thin, silk-like strands of protein until a pearl is formed. Well, Pearl said she would like to have been a scientist if not a writer, and I am not a scientist, so I had to read all about knackers. It takes effort to separate a pearl from its oyster host, but when it emerges, it's a shiny, slippery, iridescent, precious gem, and it never ever returns to its oyster home. As Pearl Buck International volunteers, we work for the peace, harmony, and care of the world's children, for which the woman we know as Pearl S. Buck dedicated her life. But do we really know her? Do we know the many names that she was called throughout her life, or all the pseudonyms that she used as she wrote her 100 or so books, magazines, articles, essays, every genre? Do we know why she chose those pseudonyms? Do we know why, so to speak, she hid behind so many pseudonyms? Do we really know her real person? One could say that Saijin Jing published fiction using her knowledge of the Chinese culture under the pseudonym of Pearl S. Buck. Thus, Pearl S. Buck may have authored The Good Earth, but Saijin Jing observed it and lived it, recorded it, fictionalized it. But who is this Saijin Jing? American? Chinese? A combination? There is no comfortable or accurate title for our Pearl. She was an early example of the children she later rescued. Half American, West Virginian, Christian, blue-eyed white child of Southern Presbyterian missionaries, while the other half was a Chinese-speaking, Chinese-writing, Chinese-tutored child of the Chinese servants. Because Pearl's yellow hair marked her as a little foreign devil when she played with her Chinese friends or when she was out in public, her nurse, Amma Wang, made a black cap to disguise her hair. Like her father, who also attempted to wear a black wig to fit in better, and the biracial children she later rescued, Pearl and her family all experienced discrimination. The children knew her as Saijin Jing, her family as Pearl, and they called her Jing. Think how that must have confused her as a child. Well, let's start with what we do know. We know that Caroline Stolting Seidenstricker gave birth to her fourth child, a girl, while on sabbatical from missionary work in China with her husband down in Hillsborough. She was christened Pearl Comfort Seidenstricker. At that time, gem names such as Opal, Ruby, Pearl, Beryl, and Garnet were very popular Victorian names. In The Exile, her biography of her mother, Pearl reveals that Carrie named her daughter Pearl because she looked so beautiful with creamy white skin like a pearl. However, in her fictionalized biography of Pearl, The Exile's daughter, her younger sister, Grace S. Yockey, claims that Carrie at first called her Pearl, but sometime later she came to regret that, wished she had named her Jean. And that is the name used intimately in her family today. Her sister wrote under the name of Cornelia Spencer. I think pseudonyms must run in the family. When Carrie Seidenstricker was carrying her fourth child during her visit back home, she was comforted by the Old Testament Psalms surrounding all the Advent readings and the Lenten readings and the familiar pictures of Christ carrying the white lamb in his arms. The baby, who was born in June, must have been such a comfort to Carrie after the loss of her other children. Pearl's mother added the name of Comfort to both her two daughters, Pearl Comfort Seidenstricker and Hannah Grace Comfort Seidenstricker Yockey. The Comfort name also comes down in Pearl's family history when she named her first adopted daughter Janice Comfort Buck, and then also her later mixed-race adopted daughters later in life. Pearl herself named her own first daughter Carol in honor of her mother, Caroline, who was known by the nickname of Carrie. Following? Okay. But where did Jean originate? We can only surmise that perhaps her mother simply liked the simple name and chose to attach that to her young daughter. We cannot find that name in genealogy at this point. However, the fact that her mother regretted calling her Pearl and substituted Jean may be reflected in Pearl's later choice of using that old-fashioned name of Pearl for her writings. Moreover, if she were known as Jean within the family, then publishing her works with her legal name of Pearl may have better satisfied her parents' always preference for privacy. It is easier to hide behind a name that does not reveal the real person than to admit that conflict within a family might exist. We can also surmise that Pearl's identification with and affection for her own nickname of Jean may have been reinforced by the family's stop in France on their way once again to Virginia to help young Pearl's ability in French for college. The name of Jean, pronounced more like Jean than Jean in that language, Pearl gave her first adopted daughter, Janice, a name similar to Jean, and later named another adopted daughter, Jean. Can you imagine calling the names in that house? Okay. A hint of the same name, Jean, John, appears in Pearl's most famous pseudonym of John Sedges. I like to think that the most likely source of Jean as a nickname for Pearl can be found in the Chinese pronunciation of her name, Saizhen Jing. We know that she spoke Chinese as well as she spoke English, and that much of her time was spent in the kitchen and work areas with the Chinese servants, who acted also as daycare grannies. Her ama. Perhaps she thought of herself more as the informal Jean then than as the formal Pearl. She spent more time there. Whatever its source, Jean is a very important name to the writer we volunteers know as our Pearl. Saizhen Jing is the name on her chop, or her Chinese name written in Mandarin characters and pinyin, which she would have learned how to write as a young student. Just as she learned to form and write her name, Pearl Comfort Seidenstricker, in English, her father spoke and wrote fluent classical Mandarin. Her mother spoke and wrote common or peasant Mandarin, much to Absalon's chagrin. What would be more natural than to teach your daughter her name in 2 languages and in 2 alphabets, while her parents hoped that she would continue their work in China? Or perhaps since Carrie Seidenstricker was her children's primary homeschool teacher, Pearl learned how to write her name at her mother's knee in English, and then probably, mother had other things to do, scampered out into the kitchen to show off to her ama and the other servants how she could write it in Chinese, receive praise, receive patting, not often given in her own home or her own family. Or perhaps the translation of Saizhen Jing simply means a silk knitter or a silk weaver, and a precious gem. It became a loving nickname that the Chinese servants called this strange white child, precocious in their midst. Yet there is also a hint that her mother's choice of Pearl may not have been driven just by the sight of the baby, creamy as a pearl. We know that Carrie was homesick for her Chinese family during her 2-year sabbatical, and that she also valued the many biblical references which she was selecting and looking through for her child's name. Pearl, as we know, are formed by irritants being surrounded by that protective coat. They become layers of beautiful and slippery proteins, but at the center is a hard core, a pearl, the real hidden persona. After her very first writing attempt of Claude's story was published in the Shanghai Mercury, she was forced by her mother for all future writings to disguise her identity, control her pride behind a pseudonym. Carrie suggested all future articles published use anonymous. That didn't sit too well with our Pearl. Pearl and mother discussed other possible pseudonyms, and they both settled on the name Novice. She was thus encouraged to send in continued subsequent writings, it was almost like a homework assignment, and contribute her small monetary prizes to the family's budget and her father's Mandarin New Testament work. The first adult pseudonym that Pearl used was in 1924 at Cornell University as she was pursuing a master's degree in English while her husband furthered his graduate education in agriculture. The Laura L. Messinger Memorial Prize Contest sought essays on human progress, and Pearl's submission title encompassed that which she knew best, China and the West. She used the male pseudonym of David F. Barnes to counteract the obstacles which might hamper any chance of her winning the contest. First, Pearl was at the disadvantage of being more Chinese than American in thought and emotion, so that presenting China to a board of Western male academics who had little knowledge of the subject that she had lived her entire life. Might be futile. The second disadvantage was that she was an English major, and traditionally the prize went to a history major. And then the third disadvantage, she was a woman, competing in a predominantly male endeavor. Not only was she a woman, but she was a wife and a mother of a child with disabilities. Nevertheless, Pearl won the scholarship and the money, using David F. Barnes. Peter Kahn sees that Pearl's use of the pseudonym liberated her to declare publicly things she would not yet have said under her own name, especially when the ideas opposed those of her father and of her upbringing. David Barnes was a shield. It was not likely that Absalom would hear anything about this fictitious scholar or his obscure essay unless Pearl told him. Needless to say, she never did. We know that she put the $250 prize to good and practical use by buying a winter coat for her family in the upstate New York winter at Cornell and paying traveling expenses while searching for answers and cures for her only birth daughter, Carol. Curiosity allows us to speculate that the name was also influenced by her husband's calling as an agriculturalist, a man of barns, so to speak, a brash American David going against the Goliath of a 5,000-year-old Chinese agriculture. She later used the same name for a major character in her 1938 novel, This Proud Heart. Most of her works were published under her authorial name of Pearl S. Buck, a name which combined her legal name with the S for Seidenstricker for her father and the Buck for the first husband, John Lossingbuck. All this makes this critic wonder if her assuming of a male persona was the sign of a subconscious rebellion against the two dominant males in her life, her father and her first husband. Excuse me. The power of a pseudonym can be to level the playing field. For Pearl, it may have given necessary encouragement in the internal jostling and jousting of her role as obedient Chinese daughter, wife, and forward-looking independent woman of the Western world. However, when the American male critics insisted on seeing her as a writer on the Asian scene alone, Pearl successfully published 5 novels with American settings under the pseudonym of John Sedges. While we can speculate her use of the name John being connected with her own Chinese name Saijin Jean, John, Pearl's selection of the last name Sedges has a complicated origin also, S-E-D-G-E-S, Sedges. Publisher Richard Walsh, whom she married in 1934, was born, partially raised in Kansas, a state known for its Kansas sedges. There are thousands of them on the internet. Those weedy plants which grow in damp, low-lying areas. The pseudonym of John Sedges, then, is an all-American, Midwestern, masculine disguise for the author of her all-American stories. When Pearl chose to disguise her identity to widen her reading audience, she also discarded her gender to achieve an unbiased readership, such as she had done earlier under the pseudonym David Barnes. Another source of John Sedges is the fact that Richard Walsh loved pirates so much, he wrote 2 books on them, one on Captain Kidd and another on Marco Polo and the Chinese pirates. The Walsh family adorned the boys' bedrooms with pictures of pirates whose ships were usually turned around, anchored, ready to go for the next quick pillage. So they were anchored on sedge islands that they could quickly head out at a moment's notice. Perhaps Pearl saw an analogy of her own life in that she metaphorically turned her own literary career around when she married Walsh, her personal pirate. The same American male critics praised their discovery of a young author who must have been born and raised in Kansas. Can you imagine the tee-hees and fun conversations in the Buck household at Green Hills Farm? Ironically, Pearl used the first name of her first husband, John Lossingbuck, a man who was always addressed as Lossing. He always called her Pearl, never Jean. Peter Kahn theorizes that since Lossing Buck appears in Pearl's autobiographical My Several Worlds only as the man in the house, she is making an ironic reversal of the Chinese custom referring to the wife as the woman in the house. Kahn sees that this is a signal of her discontent. In The Time is Noon, a novel written about her life as a wife in the 1920s and 30s, but delayed with publication until 67, Pearl uses the name of Joan, a form of John for the unhappy wife. As the daughter of a father who is a God-driven Christian preacher, an emotionally starved, warm-hearted wife, Joan, in the novel, is the wife of a narrow-minded farmer and the mother of a retarded daughter whom she falls in love with a glamorous figure, an aviator named Roger Bear. It doesn't take much to see the close relationship to Pearl's own similar situation. Pearl Buck encountered fame suddenly and fairly early in her writing career, and she was 37 when that first novel was published by the John Day Company. Pearl points out that Pearl Seidenstricker did not become Pearl Buck until she was probably in her mid-20s when she married John Lossing Buck and assumed his name. She was Lossing Buck's wife until 34 in name, if not in fact or affection. To publish under the maiden name of Seidenstricker might have been viewed as an insult to her father. She disliked both the name Buck and Pearl. Within her private life, however, she held little affection for either of those names. But once she married Richard Walsh, she traveled and lived her life as Mrs. Jean Comfort Walsh. And the name Jean is an endearment reflecting their personal time. In Green Hills Farm, we have a beautiful dresser set, silver dresser set, that Richard Walsh presented her with, and it is inscribed with the initials JCW rather than any other possible combination. So what name do we call her? Take your choice. Pearl S. Buck, the Pulitzer and Nobel Prize winning author. Miss Pearl Seidenstricker, a missionary's daughter, intelligent, educated, obedient. She had long abandoned her missionary zeal and had broken with the Presbyterian mission. Certainly, she had never been compliant, obedient daughter as the Chinese cherished ideal or the daughter her father envisioned. When she replaced her mother Carrie as the nurse and counselor to many needy Chinese peasant women, the respectful titles of foster mother and wise mother transferred to her, and she willingly responded accordingly, even after her first marriage, and of course, as we know, at the end of her life. Mrs. John Lossing Buck, the helpmate and companion of a missionary agriculturalist, she became aware of the farming community around her. As a wife, she introduced him to Chinese farmers, translated her husband's notes into classical Mandarin Chinese, and helped him edit his own prized scientific reports. She later rejected that name and the man himself. Mrs. Jean Comfort Walsh, as such, the name provided that anonymous life where she lived for over 40 years in rural Pennsylvania and whose neighbors also protected her disguise. When an inquisitive tourist asked son Richard if Pearl Buck lived here on their driveway, the boy answered no. The farm belonged to Mrs. Jean Walsh, his mother. Pearl countenanced the lie because she was Mrs. Walsh, the owner of Green Hills Farm. The fact that she was a celebrity, also known as Pearl S. Buck, was incidental and not for public knowledge. How about Mrs. Peasby? PSB. Mrs. Peasby, a name Theodore Harris invented and intimately called her late in her life. Pearl encouraged the use, up there in Danby, of many employees' names and pseudonyms to give the Danby, Vermont art and antiques area the idea that everything was just fine business-wise up there, and look how many employees they had, but they all had pseudonyms. Sai Zhenqing, the Chinese name on her chop, which she would have been taught when she began to write. Mother, perhaps her favorite title. Her children relate that she was never called Mom or Mommy. Some say she never mothered them. The formality of that title may have been a carryover from her West Virginia grandparents and the Victorian era into which she was born. Grandmother, certainly she responded to that title several times over. The next-door Welcome House neighbors, the Yoder family, shared many different titles for her. Mrs. Walsh, Miss Buck, and the children, depending on their order of birth, called her Gram by that first Welcome House adoptee, David, to that rascal young family member, Paul, who called out, "Gran, watch me," as he would go jumping and running into her pool. Interestingly, they all called Richard Walsh Mr. Walsh. Certainly, Pearl was an efficient, if not affectionate mother. After all, she earned enough money to feed, clothe, and educate 8 children of her own. At the same time, she was helping to run a publishing house, a magazine, run 5 different farms, wrote 2 contracted monthly short stories, essays, all types of essays and articles, was very active in civic and political activities, in humanitarian charities, racial equality issues, mental health awareness, in international adoptions, and in establishing a foundation to help sponsor children to a better life. The sense of disorientation and loneliness must have plagued her throughout her life, starting with the imposition of a nickname for her real name. Pearl S. Buck is the name of an author, a brand name of an imaginary person writing imaginary stories for real money to support everything that she was involved with. Kahn best describes her resolution of her name conflict. Her tombstone, which she designed herself, does not record her name in English. Instead, in a cartouche carved into an unpolished slab of Vermont marble, the Chinese characters representing the name Pearl Seidenstricker are inscribed. She had chosen to identify herself by the name and the language of her early years. Yesterday, Rob Merritt from Bluefield College here in Appalachia introduced me to another name. And this comes from, some of you may know, a poet, Kat Pleska, or Catherine, from the Charleston area. Kat evidently had a opportunity to go to a picnic, and was hunting a seat. She got a little late, so she crawled underneath like the dais and was watching out at the crowd. And there are parallels in Pearl's life. And all she remembers from that story is there was a lady whose legs were hanging down in front of her, little old lady's legs, little old lady's shoes, and varicose veins. Little did she know that when Pearl Buck was introduced, the lady with the varicose veins. Thank you for the story, Rob. Thank you so much for the privilege of being here.
Thank you, Cindy. That was fascinating. Wonderful. So our final presenter for today will be Dr. Mark Wilson, who's an educator at West Virginia University Tech. And following that, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A before we head down for the wrap-up. So if you'll just stick around a little while, we'll ask the presenters to come back up and open it up to some Q&A. Dr. Wilson?
Good morning. I have the inauspicious privilege of being the last person here, but I'll stop when I hear a big blue bus pull up. And let's see if I can get this thing going on here. There we go. Yeah, okay. What's an economist doing at a literature conference? I'm not sure. This is the first time I've ever done it. So I have a little story about Pearl Buck and a little story about John Nash, and I'm putting them together because they're the only 2 West Virginians that have won the Nobel Prize. And I'll start off with Nash. I had the good fortune to meet John Nash, and I met him quite by accident. One of my former students called me one day and said, I'm from Ripley, West Virginia, and I'm in this little contest at the Ripley Public Library, and I'm trying to look for the West Virginia Nobel Prize winner in economics. And my answer was, there isn't such a person. We don't have any Nobel Prize winners in economics. And so she said, no, that's not right. There must be one because it's here on the form, and if you find it, call me quickly because I can win a large pizza if I get this thing right. And so I go through the Nobel website the next day, and I said, I don't know where this might be. Start with 1969, which is the first year of the award, and page through one by one. Finally, I arrive at 1994, John Forbes Nash, Bluefield, West Virginia, and indeed, that's the answer to the quiz. So I call her up and I say, I found it. This is the next day, and she says, oh, so did I. It's John Nash, isn't it? And I said, yeah, that's right. And I was interested in the story of sort of the lost John Nash. And at that time, I went to the West Virginia Humanities Council, and they funded a small grant for me to go to Princeton and to meet Nash and to do some presentations with regard to his life. And it was very interesting because at the time there weren't a lot of people that knew much about Nash, and I kind of was interested in the forgotten story. So I was very grateful to them because they had kind of gotten a new intellectual interest for me. And as I was going through, I realized that West Virginia had another Nobel Prize winner, Pearl Buck. And that also has an interesting story because when I was in high school, I grew up in Colorado Springs, and as a junior in high school, we had to read The Good Earth. And I wasn't precocious enough to understand it. I reread it this summer, and I said, how did I ever read this as a junior in high school? I remember one thing about it, that I liked the book. And as I went to Penn State in graduate school, I started dating this woman who subsequently became my wife, and I was over at her apartment one night, looked up on her bookshelf, and there was a whole raft of Pearl Buck books, starting with The Good Earth. And I, of course, trying to be intellectual, I said, I've read The Good Earth. And she said, yeah, she wrote a whole bunch of stuff. And she had become interested in Pearl Buck's life. So as fate would have it, one day we were in Hillsboro on a camping trip, and we stopped at the Pearl Buck place. So I've sort of loosely associated with both of these Nobel Prize winners, and that's the credential that I have to be at a literature conference when I'm way out of field. So that's what we'll go with. Here's pictures of both of the Nobel Prize winners about the time they won the prize. As you might know, Pearl Buck won it in 1938. She won the Pulitzer in 1932, and The Good Earth came out in 1931. So that's the timeline there. She was 45 years old, thereabouts, when she won the prize, and that's a picture of her about this time. John Nash, on the other hand, was a generation later. He was from Bluefield, West Virginia. His father was an engineer for the Appalachian Power Company, a Texan that moved to West Virginia. Met his wife there. She was a West Virginia University graduate who taught English and Latin at the Bluefield High School, or Bluefield Middle School. And John Nash was one of two children born in, of course, in the 20s. So they're a generation apart, and coincidentally, they're both from somewhat the same end of the state down there in the southern part. Most of the southern part of the state now is named after Senator Byrd, but if you go a little deeper down, get around the Bluefield area, you'll see there's a lot of things named after John Nash. There's highways and buildings and so forth. And as you also may know, he died tragically a year ago in an auto accident coming back from winning the Abel Prize. So I want to talk a little bit about the Nobel Prize. We heard a beautiful little presentation about the Pulitzer yesterday, which I found very persuasive, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what the Nobel Prize is, just for the sake of contrast. There are 6 Nobel prizes every year. They usually come out in early October, so if you're a Nobel Prize junkie like I've become, you'll start looking for those the first week. As you can see, most of them are science-related. Chemistry, economics, medicine, and physics are all considered to be really the top prize in the world for scientists. And then there are 2 that are non-science related, the Peace Prize and the Literature Prize. And they were all started by the Nobel Foundation. He was a TNT magnate in Sweden back in the early 1900s, and he gave a fortune of $234 million to his bequest, and that was to be used to establish these Nobel Prizes. What's the purpose of them? They're for outstanding contributions for humanity. So it's not a body of work piece of award. It's not something that we do as a lifetime achievement attainment. It's rather for some brilliance in the fields listed above there. There are up to 3 people that can win the prize in any one field in any one year, so sometimes those are shared. Nash shared his prize and Buck did not. And they're not posthumously given either, so you have to be alive to win the thing. And they conferred quite a nice cash prize. Today it's about $1 million a prize per person, and that's another reason that if you aspire to win one of these things, it's a good thing. So let's think about just doing some quick math here. If it's been around for a little over 100 years, sometimes the prize was not given in years where there was wars. Occasionally nobody was deemed worthy of this, but for the most part it's been around for a little over 100 years, like the Pulitzer Prize, and 6 prizes a year. Actually, the economics prize has only been given since 1969, so it's the newest of the list. But you could just do some mental math and say, okay, there must be about 600 winners of this thing. And actually there have been about 1,000, accounting for people who have won it. There's a few people who have won it twice and won it in different fields, and occasionally they've split the prize. So let's kind of use that number there of 1,000 winners of Nobel Prizes over time. What I'm trying to get at here is, how does West Virginia fare vis-a-vis other states in terms of the fraction of winners? I have people say, well, 2 winners of the Nobel Prize, that's pretty good for a little state like West Virginia, isn't it? And it is pretty good. If you take that 1,000 winners and parse it out a little bit, the United States has won 300 prizes out of the 1,000 or so given. So that's a pretty nice fraction there. And West Virginians constitute 1.8 million people out of a base of 3.10 million Americans. So that's about 0.5%. And that's about the number of Nobel Prize winners we've got, too. 2 out of the 300 Americans. So I didn't want it to come out that way. Actually, I wanted it to come out that we had more than our share of Nobel Prize winners. And I can't make that case. But I can make another case. I think we have some of the most popular Nobel Prize winners. So I took that angle a little bit, and I said, okay, how can I work that one a little bit? And indeed, I think they are some of the most popular. Let me talk a little bit about why they won the prize. Most of you are well schooled in that, and that's one of the disadvantages of being last. You've heard this before. This is a little quote from Per Hallström in 1938, awarding the prize for the notable works which paved the way to a human sympathy passing over widely separated racial boundaries. Wrote a fantastic book that captured the spirit of the Nobel Committee and was awarded basically the prize for the good earth. Incidentally, she had, as I said, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1932. And if you think about what was going on in 1932 here, that was the depths of the Great Depression. And I think it's no coincidence that the good earth was received like it was. It was a peasant classic, but it also had many of the same themes that were going on in the U.S. In that same year. I heard that same theme yesterday a couple of times. So it was timely. She was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. That was another first for her. And the prize that she received was $37,900, now be worth about $649,000. So it was quite a nice prize-winning sum at the time. What did Nash get it for? He got it for game theory, and I won't talk too much about the details of game theory, but he made pioneering analysis in equilibrium theory, and the relevance of this is game theory was used for nuclear armaments and the discussions that were going on in the late 40s and the early 1950s with respect to destabilization of national arms races. So he was working on that with some very impressive people. He told me a personal story about going to see Albert Einstein when he was a 19-year-old first-year student at Princeton. And he talked about how Einstein really wasn't that impressed with what he was working on. And I thought about it, and I said, well, that probably happened a lot to people who talked to Einstein. But as I was leaving our meeting, I said, you know, I just shook the hand of someone who's shaken the hand of Albert Einstein. I said, that's pretty cool. I don't know, that might be one of my finest hours. So he was co-awarded the prize with John Harsanyi and Reinhard Selden. They each won $310,000, and now that would be equivalent to about $500,000. Nash was very poor not very poor, but he was struggling at the time. He had taken on paranoid schizophrenia. So he said that was a chance that I got my first credit card. And that was a big thing to him because he was under a lot of financial pressure before he won the prize. Like I said, Buck was 45 when she won hers. Nash was 66, so they were at different stages of their career when they won the prize. Let me quickly summarize a couple of things that might contrast the Nobel versus the Pulitzer Prizes. Both have around the same year of history. They're about as prestigious as you can get in terms of the awards they confer. Both have cash prizes, and I would summarize the Pulitzer as being more for popular cultural things. They tend to turn around a little bit quicker. In other words, if you do something that's deemed worthy of the Pulitzer Prize, you win the prize within a few years. The Nobel Prize doesn't operate that way. You make your great contribution and sometimes wait 20, 30, or 40 years before that's recognized by the Nobel Committee. There's only two people that have won both of those things, and this is a little quiz for you. Who's the guy on the left? Yeah, John Steinbeck of Mice and Men and Grapes of Wrath and all the rest of that. Those are the two winners that have won the two of the prizes. Very rare feat. And in developing this theme about the two popular prize winners in West Virginia, another angle I took was how did the people react to finding this out? And as I said, I was surprised that Nash actually won it, and I figured other people didn't know about it either, so I dug into that a little bit, and I looked into what was going on in the U.S. in the late 1930s. Well, that was the depths of the Depression. The Depression was just starting to resolve itself, but it was still pretty bad times. If you think about what was going on in Europe at the same time, Hitler was gathering strength in Germany, creating the Nazi war machine, and just before the breakout of World War II was occurring over there. And in the U.S., let me hold that story for just a minute. You were all alive in the mid-1990s. I think we've got that covered, but not so much for some of my undergraduate students now. I say, where were you in the 1990s? And they can't answer, or at least the early ones. Here's some local reaction. This is the Charleston Gazette, the leading paper in the state. And this was what was on the first page the day that Buck earned the prize. You can see some of the stories are just the same. Jubilant GOP maps new strategy for the 40 election. That didn't change much, did it? And got the blue states and the red states aligning themselves. They look a little different now than they did there. GOP staging a comeback. Make America Great Again, version 1, I don't know, something like that. End of the post-war celebrates Nazi Germany is listed there on the right side of the page, and you can see that they're starting to gather power, and this was what was going on in Europe. If you read down the page, however, you see this. This is the Charleston Gazette. Pearl Buck wins the 1938 Nobel Prize, and that is a AP story that was run the day after that she won the prize. So that's indicative of some recognition, I think, that's important. They identified in the state's leading newspaper her story. I read the Morgantown paper on that same day, and they also identified the story, but it was the same story running, and it was in the second section of the paper, so it didn't get the traction up here that it did in Morgantown or in Charleston. This is the reaction to Nash, and this is one of the reasons that I think West Virginians missed that story. Charleston Gazette, page 7B, Game Theory wins Nobel Prize for Economics. a lot of people might not have even read that story to find out that it was a native West Virginian that was listed in there. It does list John Nash as being from Bluefield as one of the things, but you have to read the entire story. I looked back to see what was going on during that week in the paper, and can you remember back in October 1994, on the front page, the O.J. Simpson murder trial. So that's what gathered the headlines there. Incidentally, this is a big week for some of you that can remember that story. This is when Lance Ito made the judgment on the bloody glove, and that was what was on the first page. So you can kind of remember that story as well. And so Nash's prize was relegated to the 7th page of Section B. Not much recognition in terms of it was also Pitt Week, by the way. And so if you go to the sports page, you read about Don Nehlen and some of the things in the football. This story didn't gather much local influence. It got a little more traction in Bluefield. This came out the next day. There were 3 stories about John Nash in their local paper. They interviewed his high school teacher and did some other things to sort of tell his story. Okay, if I could, if this thing runs, I know I'm short on time, but I'd like to show you a couple of little snippets from the Buck Prize ceremony. This just takes 2 minutes, and she took the prize with Enrico Fermi. There were just 2 winners in 1938. He was the chemist, the great Italian physicist and chemist that was later involved in the Manhattan Project and went to Chicago and worked on the detonation of the first atomic bomb. But you can see Buck receive her prize, and I think this is, if I can get this to go, I think it's worth a minute and a half. Little arrow down here. Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay.
For the first time in history, we are privileged to present pictures of King Gustav of Sweden at the meeting of the most famous learned society in the world. The Nobel Prize takes its name from the Swedish musician's magnet.
Yeah, let
and
me.
His entire fortune to be distributed in annual prizes to world leaders in art and science. This year, the literary prize has been awarded to famous for her novel, The Good Earth. And today, Miss Buck is in Stockholm to receive her prize.
Okay, let me just back up because I kind of messed that up, if you would.
For the first time in history, we are privileged to present pictures of King Gustav of Sweden at the meeting of the most famous learned society in the world. The Nobel Prize takes its name from the Swedish musician's magnate, who left his entire fortune to be distributed in annual prizes to world leaders in art and science. This year, the literary prize has been awarded to American authoress Pearl Buck, famous for her novel The Good Earth. And today, Miss Buck is in Stockholm to receive her prize and the congratulations of the Swedish king. The King of Democratic Sweden honors a citizen of democratic America, showing the rest of the world that art is international, and genius knows no frontiers.
That's Enrico Fermi next to her. All right. Yeah. Sorry for the quiet or the inability to get that to sound right, but. Okay, let me just wrap up here. I know I'm about out of time, but just want to talk a couple of minutes about what they did after the prize. So they won their prizes. As I said, Buck won it relatively early in her career. She had a long career after that. She wrote prolifically for the next 35 years and did much philanthropy and a whole lot after the prize. Nash, on the other hand, sort of found his, not found his identity, but became recognized. And he, as I said, had a long run of paranoid schizophrenia that really took away his most productive years. It landed on him when he was around 30. He didn't go into full remission until he was nearly 60, so there were at least 25 or 30 years that he was not productive in the customary sense of a mathematician. He was discovered again, rediscovered, if you will, in 2001. That was about the time I was meeting with him and talking to him. It was Ronnie Howard was doing the same thing from an entirely different angle, and of course that became ultimately the movie A Beautiful Mind. And he went on to regain rational thought. He still was speaking and working on various kinds of papers. He won the Abel Prize in Math in 2015, and it was on that return home trip that he was killed in the auto accident. That's a Nobel, or that's a honorary doctorate that he was given, and this is sort of my last little piece of information. That was when I taught at the University of Charleston, and we awarded him the first honorary doctorate that he got in 2002. West Virginia Tech subsequently honored him with an honorary doctorate in 2006, and he won a couple more as well. Pearl Buck earned 12 honorary doctorates. I wasn't able to find a list of that, but that's another little project I'm trying to nail down. So, here's kind of the end of it. West Virginia's lucky to have these people. They're very popular. They seem to be very well liked and now very well known, and that's quite an accomplishment. Most states can't name their honorary or their Nobel Prize winners in many cases because they tend to be less obscure than Buck and Nash have been. And I think their accomplishments have fit well with what Albert Nobel tried to do when he set up his prize, to make awards for key contributions in humanity and academic life. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So before we leave the room, since we did run a little bit behind, I'd like to invite the presenters back up and take maybe a couple questions for each of them, if there are some, before we go. Any questions from the room?
Angela, have you read the final chapter by Beverly Stills?
I have. The
Okay.
secretary that...
Yes.
Can you-
Yeah, that was another book I...
Can you answer
I'm
up here
sorry.
so that we can
Yes,
capture
I have read that book, and I thought about it including it, but I hesitated to go to that part of her story. I really want to, maybe down the road, but I have that book, yes. I love that book. Mhm.
I'd like to say something about Pearl's book. Her Chinese name, Sai Zhenzhu. And maybe it is a given name by his father, because his father has a Chinese name, Sai Zhaoxiang. Sai maybe comes from their family name. Yeah, this is with the similar pronunciation of the Chinese pronunciation, Sai. Sai means better than something. And then Zhenju, Pearl in Chinese means Zhenju. Zhen, the first character means precious. And Zhu means the pearl. And maybe it is given by his father with the same family name, the Chinese pronunciation. Maybe.
I believe that my understanding is that Pearl herself asked for that CHOP translation, and it was given to her in her adult life. I don't think really, other than for the use of her, the CHOP that we display. But she asked for that, it's my understanding. Janet, do you have a clarification? Anyone else on our? But yes,
Yeah, anyway, Sai happens to be a Chinese surname. And we usually put the surname also given it. Sai happens to be, the sound, the pronunciation happens to be a Chinese surname. Yeah, so Sai Zhenzu, a surname, a given name, right? Pearl in Chinese actually, it is equal to apple of one's eye, to show the kind of love from her parents to Pearl. Yeah. So they are combined together. Yeah.
would you pronounce it more correctly as a Jun sound?
Zhenju.
Well, just so you know, once I could get to Saijin Jing, they said good, Cindy.
Okay, do we have one more? Go ahead.
Do we know how many West Virginians have won the Pulitzer?
It's just a handful, maybe a half dozen at most. As we contemplated this conference, we started looking at Pulitzers. And I want to say 4 or 5. And of course, Pearl is by far the best known. So that's how we landed on it.
Well, how about another round of applause for our presenters?